January morning, Southwark Crown Court. The kind of cold that settles into stone. Outside, pensioners stand in scarves and gloves, clutching folders thick with statements, brochures, and letters they never thought they'd need. Some traveled for hours just to be here. Some have waited years. Inside courtroom 1, 3 former directors sit in dark suits, expressionless. No jungle, no trees, no sunshine. Just fluorescent lights and the sound of papers moving. For more than a decade, thousands of ordinary people were told their retirement money was growing in Costa Rica. They were shown plantations, timber forecasts, GPS coordinates, ethical branding, a future where their pensions would rise quietly in the sun. Instead, prosecutors would describe something else. Luxury homes, supercars, foreign holidays, millions diverted while the people funding it were told to be patient. Some of the victims in that courtroom had already retired once. Now, they were back at work. Others had downsized, borrowed from family, or watched plans for old age collapse into anxiety and bills. Because this was never just about trees. It was about trust. And by the time the men at the front of the courtroom finally faced justice, the forest investors were promised had long since become something else entirely. A graveyard for savings. By the time authorities finished counting the damage, around £70 million had passed through the scheme. More than 3,000 investors had bought in. Most were not speculators. They weren't chasing luxury or gambling on some wild startup. They were retirees, workers nearing retirement, couples trying to protect pension pots they had spent decades building. Many invested sums between £20,000 and £50,000. For some, it was more. For others, it was nearly everything. They were told their money was moving into sustainable forestry in Costa Rica. Real land, real trees. A tangible asset that could grow regardless of stock market chaos. Something solid. Something ethical. Something safer than the system they had learned not to trust. But behind the polished brochures in green language was a machine that consumed money faster than any forest could grow it. Because, while investigators worked through paperwork, liquidations, and court dates, people were aging. Bills were rising. Retirement was getting smaller. This wasn't a story about investors losing a bet. It was about ordinary people discovering that the future they paid for had already been spent. To understand why so many people said yes, you have to remember the moment they were living in. The financial crash had shattered confidence. Savings accounts paid almost nothing. Markets felt unpredictable. Traditional pensions looked confusing, slow, and exposed to forces ordinary people couldn't control. Then came a different kind of promise. Take your pension money and move it somewhere tangible. Land, trees, timber. Investors were told they could secure retirement while supporting sustainable forestry in one of the world's most famous eco-friendly countries. Profit and conscience wrapped into the same package. Costa Rica sounded clean, stable, forward-thinking. The word ethical did the rest. For many older investors, this didn't feel reckless. It felt sensible. Safer than paper assets. Smarter than leaving money idle. The theft did not begin in Costa Rica. It began with a phone call. Investors were contacted by firms offering pension reviews, wealth checks, or opportunities to improve underperforming retirement funds. The tone was professional, helpful, urgent without sounding desperate. Many callers presented themselves as specialists. Some appeared independent. Some spoke the language of advisors, not salesmen. Once trust was established, the next stage followed quickly. Existing pensions were described as stagnant, too exposed, too slow, too weak for the future. Then came the alternative. A forestry investment with strong projected returns, environmental credibility, and a story simple enough for anyone to understand. Trees grow, timber sells, demand rises. Investors benefit. Brochures arrived polished and reassuring. Charts, photographs, projected harvest dates, certificates assigning specific plots or trees. Even coordinates that made the investment feel precise and personal. But behind the polished front end was something far less natural. Large commissions could be taken from investor money almost immediately. Introducers were rewarded for funneling more people in. Sales momentum mattered more than forestry performance. The system needed confidence. So, confidence was manufactured. And while investors believed they were transferring pensions into long-term growth, a significant share of their money had already begun disappearing before a single tree could earn a penny. The central problem was not whether trees were planted. It was where the money went after investors paid in. Large slices of investor capital could vanish at the point of sale. Introducers and sales networks were rewarded for bringing in fresh money. That meant every new pension transfer generated immediate winners long before any plantation could produce returns. Then came the lifestyles. Evidence presented by authorities pointed to luxury properties worth millions, expensive vehicles, overseas travel, and high-end spending funded while investors were being told to wait for growth. The contrast was brutal. In Costa Rica, forestry requires patience, maintenance, planning, labor, harvest, strategy, and years of disciplined management. In the UK, investor money was moving much faster. Some funds were allegedly used to maintain appearances, including payments or reassurances that helped keep confidence alive. New money helped sustain the story while the underlying economics weakened. And that may be the clearest sign of all. Real forestry businesses spend heavily before profits arrive. This scheme appeared to spend heavily on something else entirely. By the time many investors realized returns were uncertain, large amounts had already been converted into commissions, assets, and lifestyles impossible to recover quickly. The trees may have needed years to mature. The extraction of investor money did not. And once enough had been taken out, the forest itself was no longer the main business. Fraud rarely announces itself in one dramatic moment. Usually, it begins with small discomforts. For ethical forestry investors, the first signs were delays, silence, and explanations that seemed reasonable if you wanted to believe them. Annual updates became less consistent. Projected timelines shifted. Questions about harvests or returns were met with technical language, long-term reasoning, or reminders that forestry required patience. Some investors accepted that. Trees, after all, do not grow overnight. But others began noticing something harder to ignore. Communication was thinning just as confidence should have been increasing. If plantations were maturing, why did information feel more vague? If the investment was healthy, why were investors chasing answers? Complaints started building. Some began researching the company more deeply. Others looked again at the paperwork they had trusted years earlier. And as regulators started paying closer attention, a more dangerous possibility emerged. This might not be a slow investment facing delays. It might be something else entirely. At first, it looked like inconvenience. Then it began to look like warning. Once liquidators, investigators, and forensic accountants began pulling the structure apart, the deeper problem became clearer. This was not simply a forestry project that had underperformed. It was a model carrying contradictions from the start. A genuine plantation business needs years of disciplined spending before serious returns are possible. Land must be suitable. Trees must be planted correctly. Growth monitored. Disease managed. Harvest logistics prepared. Cash preserved for maintenance long before profits arrive. That requires patience and capital protection. But significant investor money had already been consumed elsewhere. Commissions reduced incoming funds. Director benefits drained more. Luxury spending suggested priorities far removed from plantation management. And if too much money leaves early, the future it was meant to fund becomes weaker every year. That is where many schemes reveal themselves. They continue selling tomorrow while quietly hollowing out today. Some evidence suggested investors were still being reassured long after the economics had become deeply questionable. Fresh money helped sustain confidence while the underlying project struggled to justify the promises attached to it. From the outside, it still looked like forestry. Inside, it increasingly resembled extraction. Not a business built around timber harvests. A business built around attracting capital first and worrying about viability later. By late 2015, the story could no longer hold. Ethical forestry entered liquidation. For investors, the word landed with a different weight than any missed update or delayed projection ever had. Liquidation meant this was no longer about patience. It was about what remained. And for many, that answer was devastating. The company offices fell quiet. Administrators and liquidators moved in. Records were examined. Assets traced. Creditors lined up. Thousands of investors suddenly found themselves in the same position. They had paid into a future that no longer existed. Some still hoped the plantations might somehow recover value. Others believed authorities would quickly return substantial funds. But insolvency processes move slowly, and recovered money often arrives in fractions, if at all. Then came the criminal investigation. The Serious Fraud Office, working with police, began digging into the directors, the money flow, and the years of promises behind it all. Raids followed. Charges would eventually come later. But by then, the essential damage had already happened. The collapse did not begin when the company entered liquidation. It began years earlier, when investor money started leaving the business faster than any forest could replace it. Liquidation merely made it visible. Statistics can describe the scale. They cannot describe the feeling. Many victims were not wealthy investors absorbing a bad quarter. They were ordinary people who believed decades of work had finally bought them security. Some had moved pension savings built over entire careers. Others invested inheritances meant to strengthen retirement. Couples made decisions together, expecting stability later in life. Then, the later years they planned for began shrinking in front of them. Some delayed retirement. Some returned to work. Some downsized homes, cut heating costs, borrowed from family, or abandoned plans they thought were already paid for. The emotional cost was often worse than the financial one. Embarrassment, anger, the shame of feeling tricked. The stress of explaining to spouses or children that money once considered safe was gone. One victim said they had never wanted to be rich. That line captures the cruelty of schemes like this. They do not steal luxury, they steal certainty. And certainty is often what retirement savings are really for. For many victims, the hardest part was not just losing money. It was realizing that while they were planning for old age, someone else had been spending it. Years after the sales calls, brochures, and liquidation notices, the story reached a courtroom. Southwark Crown Court became the place where the language finally changed. No more sustainability pitches. No more patient growth narratives. No more talk of forests quietly maturing overseas. Instead, prosecutors laid out allegations of fraudulent trading, deception, and the misuse of investor funds on a vast scale. The polished image that had once sold the scheme was replaced by financial records, asset trails, witness evidence, and the voices of people who had trusted it. Directors who once fronted an ethical opportunity now faced criminal consequences. For victims, the courtroom could not restore the lost years. It could not rebuild pension pots at the age they once stood. It could not return the confidence many had in financial advice, institutions, or their own judgment. But it could do one important thing. It could name what happened. Not a failed green venture. Not unfortunate market conditions. Not a project that simply ran out of luck. A scheme built on promises that did not match reality. And sometimes, after years of delay, truth arriving publicly still matters. Even when it arrives too late to make people whole. Long after the court dates end, harder questions remain. How did thousands of people get steered into something so unsuitable? Why were commission-driven introducers able to sit so close to retirement money? Why did ethical branding lower suspicion instead of raising it? How much money, if any, can ever truly be recovered once years have passed and assets have moved? And why do scams so often survive by borrowing the language people most want to believe? Security, growth, responsibility. This case was not only about 3 directors or one company. It exposed how easily trust can be engineered when fear, hope, and complexity meet in the same place. For victims, the consequences did not end with convictions or headlines. They continued in monthly budgets, postponed retirements, and quieter versions of loss that never make the news. They were told their pensions would grow quietly in the Costa Rican sun. In a way, something did grow. Commissions, luxury, delay. And by the time the truth was finally harvested, many of the people who paid for it had already lost the years they were trying to protect.